The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 20663 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to business. Any member who wishes to speak should press their request to speak button now, and I call on the Minister to move the motion.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 20663 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. Our first item of business this afternoon is a motion of condolence in the name of John Swinney. And today, our flags fly at half-mast as a mark of our respect for the Right Honourable the Lord Wallace of Tankerness, KC, Jim Wallace. We are honoured to welcome Jim's wife Rosie, daughters Helen and Claire, brother Neil and other close family and friends to our gallery today. The devolution referendum of 1997 was a major part of my political awakening, as I'm sure it was for many in Scotland, an opportunity that spoke to a politics that sought to bring active democracy closer to the people. The question of whether or not there should once more be a Scottish Parliament and what powers that Parliament might have was the debate of the time, and Jim Wallace's role cannot be overstated. The most passionate of advocates for devolved government, his persuasive, eloquent yet relatable contribution inspired confidence in the idea of this institution. He played a major part in securing the yes, yes vote that he worked so hard for, not just in TV and radio studios, but behind the scenes too, where he worked collaboratively using the skills, experience and expertise that he carried so lightly and put to such great effect for the people of Scotland. This is my 27th year in the Scottish Parliament, and I know that without Jim Wallace, Parliament would be a different place, a lesser one. Jim lived our parliamentary values of wisdom, integrity, justice and compassion, constantly demonstrated through his incredible career. His steadying hand in some challenging early days was just what was needed. Jim Wallace is a pillar of this Parliament. I feel truly privileged to have had an opportunity, particularly in recent years, at formal and less formal events, to get to know Jim better. From the kirking of this session of the Parliament to his visits as moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, I've learned so much from him. And most recently, we had great chat about family, fun and health. Jim Wallace knew what mattered most to people. And with the people of Scotland, the Parliament mourns his passing, gives heartfelt thanks for his contribution and shares our deepest condolences with his family. First Minister.
Presiding Officer, Jim Wallace may not have designed the Scottish Parliament building in which we meet today, but we can say with absolute certainty that Jim Wallace was an architect of the Scottish Parliament. Jim was a lifelong adherent of the Liberal tradition in Scotland. Although he led the Scottish Liberal Democrats, he first joined the Scottish Liberal Party, a party that emerged from a radical tradition of politics in our country, with a commitment in its foundations to Home Rule for Scotland. Consistent political support for the concept of Scottish self-government, pressure to establish a Scottish Parliament, and the hard work to turn it into practice through the work of the Consultative Steering Group were all part of the contribution made by Jim Wallace. Jim was first elected to the United Kingdom Parliament in 1983 as MP for Orkney and Shetland. He followed in the footsteps of another great Liberal, Joe Grimmond, and had to compete for his seat with the formidable champion of my party, Winnie Ewing. He held that seat for nearly 2 decades, always a tireless champion for island communities. I got to know Jim well when I joined him in the House of Commons in 1997 and watched, with respect and admiration, a formidable parliamentarian from whom I learnt a great deal about how to be a parliamentarian, lead the arguments for the Liberal Democrats during the debates on the referendum legislation in 1997, and then the passage of the Scotland Act in 1998, which paved the way for the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. It was little surprise that Jim opted to stand for Holyrood in 1999, for Orkney, the island archipelago where he lived, and that he loved. Jim ushered the Liberal Democrats into government in 1999, the first time Liberals had been in government in the United Kingdom since 1922, and assumed the role of Scotland's first Deputy First Minister, a role in which he served from 1999 to 2005. He served also as Minister for Justice and later Minister for Enterprise and Lifelong Learning. In this role, in 2004, Jim attended the United Nations to hear Secretary-General Kofi Annan deliver the inaugural Robert Burns Memorial Lecture on the theme of the state of the world and the brotherhood of man, calling for tolerance and coexistence amongst all peoples. I can't be alone in thinking that these were themes that Jim Wallace championed throughout his political career, and of which we could do with a great deal more in the world today. As Deputy First Minister, Jim became Acting First Minister 3 times, stepping in first when Donald Dewar became ill, and a second time upon his untimely death. He stepped in again following Henry McLeish's resignation. In doing so, he provided stability and a steady hand in times of unexpected upheaval. But more than that, in this Parliament's early years, when it was yet to prove itself in the eyes of many Scots, Jim sought to ensure that it delivered what the people had voted for in 1997, a Parliament that worked together across parties to get things done and to improve life for all Scots. In 2007, he became Baron Wallace of Tankerness and a member of the Calman Commission on Devolution that recommended extending the powers of this Parliament. When the Liberal Democrats became part of the United Kingdom Government in 2010, Jim found himself back on the front line, serving for 5 years as Advocate General for Scotland. It was in this role that he brought forward the idea to use a Section 30 order to give the Scottish Parliament the power to hold an independence referendum, a visionary move in my eyes. In all of these roles, Jim offered an exemplary example of public service, but he still had more to give. In 2021, he was delighted, but also pretty daunted, to become the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, one of only 2 elders since the Reformation to hold that post. It was during COVID, and Jim, supported as always by Rosie, found a way of reaching people in those difficult days, supporting and reassuring them that more hopeful days lay ahead. It was a year of great fulfilment for Jim, where he could share with others his deep Christian faith and how his faith had made him who he was, in a way that is often more difficult to do in politics. As moderator, he reached across the aisle, helping to bring the Church of Scotland into greater collaboration with the Episcopal and Catholic churches. Throughout his life, Jim practised politics the way politics ought to be practised, with passionate but respectful debate, with genuine collaboration, and above all, with the utmost compassion and devotion to those he served. That was the type of person he was, selfless and principled, a man of integrity, a man of decency. Jim and I were clearly from different political traditions. We believed in different things, we believed in different destinations for our country. But none of those differences stopped us respecting each other's contribution to our country's politics, never doubting each other's motives, always maintaining personal courtesy towards each other. At joyful moments in my life, and at incredibly tough moments in my life, I would receive kindness from Jim Wallace, as did so many others. When I became Deputy First Minister in 2014, Jim wrote to wish me well, as he put it, from one Deputy First Minister to another. He encouraged me to enjoy the role, especially the fun that was to be had when I stood in for the First Minister at First Minister's Questions, as he put it to me, with all of the opportunity and none of the responsibility. To mark the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, I had the great privilege to welcome Jim and Rosie to Bute House in your presence, Presiding Officer, to mark the occasion. I felt it was important that we marked a milestone in the life of our Parliament. One of its key founders should be welcomed to Bute House to acknowledge the significance of the occasion. It was so appropriate that both Jim and Rosie were there so that I could acknowledge, on behalf of the whole country, the outstanding service that they have given to Scotland. On the last occasion I questioned Jim in his capacity as Acting First Minister on the 22nd of November 2001, it was at the end of a period of Labour political chaos. Generously, I said to Jim, "Mr Wallace will not be here to answer questions next week, but I'm sure that he will have to come back to rescue the Labour administration when it implodes. Does he agree with me that it's not appropriate today for us to say goodbye, but that we should say merely au revoir?" There is genuine and heartfelt sadness on my part today that we are here to say goodbye and not au revoir to Jim Wallace. He's been taken from us all far, far too soon. But I have to give the last word of our exchange in 2001 to Jim. In reply to my impertinent question, the Acting First Minister of the day said, "On Mr Swinney's final point, I say only this. When the history books are written, it will be found that I might not have discharged the duties of First Minister for as long as other people did, but I probably did it more often." It was a typically Jim Wallace quip, but he was right about his place in the history of Scotland's story. I want to end by expressing my own personal deepest sympathies and those of the Scottish Government and the people of Scotland to Jim's wife Rosie, his mother Grace, his daughters Helen and Claire, his brother Neil, and to his grandchildren. They have all lost a dear loved one, and Scotland has lost one of her finest sons.
Thank you. I now call on Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I start by thanking you and the First Minister for such heartfelt words. Jim's family and my party have been overwhelmed by the kindness shown to us in these difficult days. We are heart-sore at his loss, but the outpouring of love and respect that has come forth from all sides of this chamber has been such a balm at this difficult time. And what does the Lord require of you but to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God? Presiding Officer, this verse from the book of Micah was read to Church of Scotland congregations the country over this Sunday. It's just a part of the normal rhythms of the Kirk at this time of year. And yet, those words speak to the qualities and life choices of Jim Wallace, perhaps more than any other passage in Scripture. Jim was a man of profound Christian faith. The values in those words speak to so much about his politics and his dedication to public service. It was in Elphinstone Hall in the University of Aberdeen during the referendum campaign of 1997 to establish this Parliament that I first heard Jim Wallace speak. I was just a student at the time, but that night he inspired me to recognise that I was a Liberal, that I absolutely agreed that there should be a Scottish Parliament, and that I wanted, one day, to have the opportunity to serve in it. Presiding Officer, the torrent of praise that has rightly been offered about Jim this weekend focused on the many achievements he made in the high offices that he held. But it is often forgotten just how much about this place we owe to Jim. He was central to the Constitutional Convention that made the case for devolution, and with the referendum won, became an architect of our reconvened Parliament and of modern Scotland. He was a details man. He took great pride in, for want of a better word, the geekery of its formation, in helping to draft the conventions and the standing orders that we still observe today. He loved this chamber. He was so proud of his involvement in its establishment and what it would go on to achieve. And, Presiding Officer, so much of that was made possible by his ability to work across party lines, and in particular, his friendship with the late Donald Dewar. Jim is celebrated for his ability to lay aside political tribalism and to reach for the better nature of his adversaries. There is such rancour in our politics today, we could all learn something about his approach and lean into his legacy of doing politics through grace and reconciliation. While he was a man of towering intellect, he was largely bereft of technical know-how or any sort of coordination. Indeed, Rosie, his wife, describes him as being completely hornless. Discovering him one afternoon astride the ride-on lawnmower, having gone up and down their garden for hours, not realising that the filter was blocked and he hadn't clipped a single blade of grass. Or the first day of our election campaign in 2003, which we kicked off with a balloon launch. But at the moment of their release, the cameras of the nation's media were not trained on the cascade of golden balloons ascending into the stratosphere, but rather they were focused on the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, who had become hopelessly entangled in the fishing net we'd used to collect them. Indeed, our press officer, Neil McKinnon, literally had to rip a button from his suit jacket to set him free. But we didn't need Jim for his coordination or for his technical know-how. We needed him for his grasp of political strategy, for his stoicism, for his ability to discern the true north of our liberal values. Nicol, Tavish, Willie and I, as his successors in leadership, have all turned to Jim for counsel and support. It is why I had no hesitation in appointing him as chair of our Scottish general election campaign in 2024. I am heartily glad that he lived to see the revival of our party and played such a role in it, and the best election result for Liberals in his lifetime. But while Jim was a mainstay of support to us, he could not have achieved anything without the bedrock of support that he received from his family and in particular, his wife, Rosie. I love this story of how they met. It was the summer of 1979, and Jim had almost forgotten about the Shakespeare-themed fancy dress party he'd been invited to in the neighbouring flat. It was after midnight when he finally remembered, so he shoved a couple of lilac bush branches down the back of his jumper and he knocked the door. Rosie, in full costume, this is the first time they met, answered the door exclaiming, "I'm Titania, Queen of the Fairies. Who on earth are you?" To which he replies, "I'm Birnam Wood come to Dunsinane." Rosie, Helen, Claire and Neil, thank you for helping him to become the giant that he was and for sharing him with us. We have so much love for you and we will continue to hold you in the light that shines. Presiding Officer Jim Wallace acted justly. He loved mercy and he walked humbly with God. We are all the poorer now he is gone, but this Parliament and this country are immeasurably richer because he lived. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It was with enormous shock and sadness that we learned last week of the death of Jim Wallace, who I had the privilege of knowing both as a political opponent and as a friend over many years. The last time I saw him was back in September at the Holyrood Garden Party at the Botanic Gardens, where we had a good chat and catch-up, typically over a drink. And I knew he had been through some major surgery at that time, and I commended him on how well he was looking. But clearly there were underlying health issues which very sadly caught up with him at the much too young age of 71. There's been a great deal written over the past few days about Jim's distinguished career as a lawyer, as a politician and in the church. He was, until the time of the celebrated Conservative Liberal Democrat UK coalition government in 2010, the most senior Liberal to hold political office in Britain for decades. And he performed his duties as Deputy First Minister of Scotland with distinction. And in the first term of this Parliament, he was a rock of stability in a period which saw 3 Labour First Ministers. But Jim was always there, on 3 occasions having to take on the role of acting First Minister. Despite his genial manner, he was tougher than he looked, as anyone involved in discussions with him would quickly find out. But he was straightforward and decent in his dealings, and was somebody of whom it could truly be said that there was no side to him. He was excellent company. I remember on many occasions sharing a pint and chewing over matters of mutual interest, not least talking football. And there we had something in common, because Jim was, along with Alistair Morrison, Andy Kerr, myself and a few others, members of that informal group known as the Holyrood True Blues Rangers Supporters Club. And one of Jim's proudest moments came in May 2000, when, as Deputy First Minister, he attended the Scottish Cup final and was asked to present the cup to the winning captain. Now, that match was between Aberdeen and his beloved Rangers, and he could hardly contain his delight at handing it over to the Rangers captain, Arthur Newman, following a 4-0 victory. Jim was also a man of faith. He was a loyal elder at St Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall over years, and it was entirely fitting when he was appointed moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, a role where he took his duties as seriously as he had done when Deputy First Minister. More recently, he and Rosie sang in the choir at Dunblane Cathedral, maintaining his lifelong link with the Kirk. When people die, there's always an urge to say how nice they were, even if that's not always entirely true. In Jim Wallace's case, everyone can say that quite truthfully. He was, in all he did and in all his dealings with people, a genuinely nice man. In the words of the former First Minister Jack McConnell, he was the best of men. On behalf of the Scottish Conservatives, may I offer my sincerest condolences to Rosie, to Helen, to Claire, to Neil and to the wider family.
Thank you. I now call on Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by saying how phenomenal the speeches have been before me, and it is a genuine privilege to speak about the great man that was Jim Wallace, and we are all on this side deeply, deeply saddened by his passing. And first and foremost, our thoughts are with his amazing wife Rosie, his two daughters Helen and Claire, and his brother Neil. I know they will feel his passing most deeply. I know how huge a part of their life he was, but honestly, they should be so proud of the man he was, what he dedicated his life to, and what he achieved. And also condolences to our friends in the Liberal Democrats. I know they will feel his loss so sharply, but he was honestly loved and respected right across the political spectrum, as you've heard today. I was actually thinking, when putting together the comments today, about what are the words I would use to describe Jim Wallace. Kindness, decency, wisdom, principle, dedicated. Kindness. Every single time you met him, he met you with warmth and enthusiastic encouragement, regardless of what politics you had. Decency, because he believed in bringing people together. And he did his politics through gentle persuasion, rather than some of the maybe more cut and thrust of modern political times. Wisdom, because he could see ahead. I know how significant a role he played in persuading Labour politicians about devolution and this Parliament, or indeed SNP politicians about devolution and this Parliament. Principle, because he was such a proud believer in devolution in the Scottish Parliament, and he shares in all the successes that this Parliament has had. And I should also say, I know there have been Labour First Ministers. Those Labour First Ministers could not have done their job if they wouldn't have a man of the stature of Jim Wallace alongside them. And dedication. Dedicated to his family, to liberty, to public service, to faith, to Scotland, and of course to Rangers, which was obviously a deep passion of his too. And throughout all the roles he had, he was a unifier, whether as an MP, an MSP, Deputy First Minister, Advocate General or Moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. He believed in bringing people together, people of all faiths, all political persuasions. He believed in bringing them together to make progress as a country. And I want to end with the words he said when he was Moderator. Today we must be ready to go out from our buildings and get alongside people in our towns and cities, in homes, around tables, in the fields of work. all in the good cause to spread hope and humanity. Presiding Officer, Jim Wallace leaves our politics poorer. He leaves our social circles poorer. He leaves Scotland poorer without him. But he also leaves us with an example to follow, a life dedicated to public service and to ideals, and a life dedicated to the great people of Scotland. So to Rosie and all his family, we send our deepest condolences. We were all so lucky to know him and to have him.
Thank you. I call Gillian Mackay.
Jim Wallace was one of the founders of devolution. Without him, our Parliament would be a weaker and less ambitious place. I didn't know Jim on a personal level as well as many others did. But the few times I did meet him, he was warm, funny, and quick to offer genuine advice to a very new MSP who had a lot to learn. And I regret that I've not had the pleasure of working with him or serving in this chamber with him. In preparing my remarks, I spoke to colleagues who'd worked with Jim, and their view, as has been so far across the chamber, was unanimous. They describe an unwaveringly decent and kind person who took Parliament seriously and who took Scotland seriously. When he worked, it was with integrity, and when he disagreed with colleagues, it was always in a spirit of respect. Jim was only the second person who wasn't a Kirk minister to take on his role since the 16th century. And the moderator is clearly a non-partisan, party-neutral role. So Jim did what he had to do and resigned his membership of the Liberal Democrats for the year of his tenure, a commitment on his part that his public service was above party politics. My co-leader Ross Greer was grateful to know a deeply thoughtful man with an unparalleled commitment to serving Scotland through both politics and the Kirk. His term coincided with Glasgow hosting the COP26 Climate Summit. That resulted in Ross's personal highlight of the conference, forming a temporary double act with Jim for a guest lecture at Trinity College Glasgow about faith and the small g green politics. This experience illustrated a direct experience of Jim's commitment to public service, his love for his country, and how his deeply held personal faith influenced his political life. In this Parliament, we should remember the committed and dedicated voices who came before us and the wonderful legacies they leave. We should be inspired by Jim's work and try to conduct ourselves in the manner which he did. A long-serving Liberal Democrat MSP, Deputy First Minister, Acting First Minister, Moderator of the General Assembly, his commitment to public service can never be in doubt. His sudden loss will be keenly felt by colleagues in the chamber, and I extend our condolences in particular to our colleagues in the Liberal Democrats. But most of all, I send my condolences to Jim's friends and family, and sincerely hope that they take comfort in the universal affection and respect that's been expressed by MSPs from across all parties.
Thank you. I now call on Willie Rennie.
Even though it seemed Jim Wallace had lived many lives in one, he was taken from us far too soon. I worked for Jim as the party's chief executive during the first Scottish Parliament elections, and then with Jim when I became a parliamentary colleague and then leader. There was so much I learned from Jim. His appetite for detail. When I was first appointed to the job, I visited him and the rest of the MPs in Westminster to discover Jim and the Scottish MPs in a meeting room immersed in the papers of the Scotland Bill, drafting endless, copious amendments to that bill. Fast forward a year to the Constitutional Steering Group, when other leaders had delegated the task to other people within their parties. Jim stepped forward, crafting the procedures and standing orders of this place. I couldn't get it. I wanted to win votes, not make rules. But Jim knew that the shape of this Parliament would leave an impression far more enduring than any short-lived campaign. And although he had an affinity for the law and procedure, he understood the essential element of politics, and that is good relationships. Now, during the coalition agreements, we had a grand procedure called the dispute resolution procedure. And people would think it was this grand committee that would meet periodically. But it was Jim and Donald Dewar, because they trusted each other implicitly. And there was wars almost every week between the Liberal Democrats and Labour groups. But every single problem was solved by that group. And that endured into a sound relationship with Jack McConnell, who spoke so movingly on the radio last week. They all trusted each other implicitly. Finally was his calm, respectful resilience. Jim endured many political crises through his 13 years as leader, 6 as Deputy First Minister, 5 as a UK Minister, 43 years as a parliamentarian in 3 different parliaments. Now, most politicians would have copious amounts of baggage as a result of those experiences. But such was the mark of his success that he went on to occupy the position of moderator, probably the closest to God that you get in the Church of Scotland. Last year, following the memorial service for George Reid in this place, with a fierce storm raging outside, I took the unusual step of skipping canvassing that day in Fife. Instead, I joined Nicol Stephen, Jeremy Purvis and Jim for a very long lunch. I am so glad that I did. We shared memories, we traded gossip, and we laughed, and we laughed, and we laughed.
I now call on Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first thank colleagues for their very generous comments this afternoon, for those who've been in touch over recent days with wonderful messages. I've drawn huge strength from those messages. I know the family have drawn comfort from the outpouring of affection and admiration that Alex Cole-Hamilton referred to recently. Jim Wallace was my boss, he was my mentor, he was my good friend. He bears responsibility for getting me hooked on politics and, like boiling the frog, slowly drawing me into standing for election. I forgave him that, although his lifelong love of Rangers was slightly more difficult to overlook. In return, Jim didn't sack me when I lodged an early day motion in his name at Westminster, congratulating Celtic's Lisbon Lions on the 25th anniversary of their historic European Cup triumph, while Jim was on holiday at the time. I was his researcher, I was his special advisor, I was his speechwriter, although I would note that Jim never actually delivered a word I wrote. Me delivering this speech feels deeply ironic in some senses. Even so, I can claim credit for Jim telling the now infamous goat joke at the Orkney Rugby Club dinner in 1991. Thankfully, it wasn't career-ending for either of us. Originally from Annan, Jim was a born-again islander. He was fiercely proud of being Orcadian. Over 4 decades, he represented the interests of islanders and our island communities with tenacity, diligence and selflessness, providing calm in times of crisis and always approachable. The people he served with such distinction in Orkney and Shetland are feeling his loss deeply right now. One I spoke to at the weekend even admitted that recent media reporting and tributes provided a timely reminder that Jim was so much more than just an excellent constituent MP and MSP, although that was always his #1 priority. And Jim got things done in government, in opposition, outside of politics. He was fiercely intelligent, but wore that intelligence lightly. I'm far from alone, as we've heard this afternoon, in having benefited from his wisdom, a wisdom that drew on his humanity, his empathy, his humility, a product, no doubt, of his deep faith. In terms of this place, of course, Jim was an architect of devolution, helping very deliberately create a parliament that would require politicians to work across party divides. not sacrificing principles, not adopting some cosy consensus, but putting in the hard graft and having the patience to find agreement that actually delivers for people, for communities and for our country. He rarely took credit for his achievements, certainly not on a personal level, and steered clear of personal attacks and abrasive styles of politics in debate that grabs headlines and followers. As a result, he was often underestimated, including by himself. Yet Jim's was a style of politics that elevated persistence over performance, sound policy over sound bites, and bringing people together rather than dividing them apart. Presiding Officer, it feels like a style of politics that is needed in this Parliament, in this country, more than ever. I first encountered Jim at Hustings in Kirkwall Grammar School during the 1983 election. In the dining hall that afternoon, Jim's insight, passion and humour cut through a wall of teenage indifference, but I did in my case, and happily thereafter with a sizable majority of voters in Orkney and Shetland. Since then, I can't think of anyone who's had more of a profound influence on me, on my perspective on how we go about building a more liberal, more tolerant and more successful society. I've so many fond memories of time in Jim's company, plotting, planning, or just gossiping, and with laughter, always with laughter. I'm devastated by the sudden and untimely death of Jim Wallace. But my heart goes out to Rosie, to Helen and Claire, his mother Grace, brother Neil and the wider family. They're having to deal with the loss of a husband, a father, a son, brother, grandpa and uncle. I'm dealing with losing one of my closest friends. And folks in Orkney and Shetland, all the way down to Annan and beyond, are coming to terms with the loss of what former First Minister Jack McConnell rightly described as the best of men. He really was the best of them.
Thank you. The question is that motion 20640 in the name of John Swinney on a motion of condolence be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed, and we will now have a short pause before we move on with this afternoon's business.